Good evening. You're all inside, like me. I think it'll be sunny in here in a few minutes anyway. I'm Ellen Levy, Chair of the Great Decisions Committee and a board member of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. Welcome to the 7th session of this year's Great Decisions Foreign Policy Series, our largest, most prestigious lecture and discussion series. We're delighted to welcome Dr. William Liddle, sitting to my left. We'd like to thank our evening sponsor tonight, Western Michigan University. Thank you very much. And of course, we thank our media sponsor, Michigan Radio. A few items before we begin our program. I know we have quite a few members here tonight, and if you are not a member currently and like to join our council, you can join for as little as $10 a year with our new email membership. This will provide you with discounted tickets for the remaining Great Decisions series and other upcoming events. This week, again, we will do a drawing for the World Affairs Council mug from anyone who likes us on Facebook or leaves a comment on our Facebook page. Last week's winner is Judy Betts, and if you're here, Judy, please pick up your mug at the registration table when you leave. Tonight, for the armchair discussion format, Dr. Liddle will present for about 15 minutes, highlighting the main themes of his topic, and then Dr. Dooley, the moderator, will ask several follow-up questions, leaving plenty of time for your audience questions. So please prepare your questions throughout the talk. And don't be shy about coming down to one of the two microphones that we have right here on the floor. Our moderator for tonight is Dr. Howard Dooley, Professor of History at Western Michigan University. And our speaker for this evening is Dr. William Liddle, a political scientist and Indonesian expert at Ohio State University. Tonight, we're treated to boots-on-the-ground experience as Dr. Liddle is recently returned from research work in Indonesia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Liddle for his presentation, Indonesia, Prospects for Prosperity. Dr. Liddle.
Thank you, Ellen. It's delightful to be here. This is the first time I've been in Grand Rapids, and we just drove through the city coming up from Kalamazoo. And I must say, it looked very beautiful going by the river and seeing the Gerald R. Ford Center and so forth. I wish I could stay longer and enjoy more of it. But anyway, it's nice to be in Grand Rapids for the very first time. There's a timer on here, and I'm going to press the button that will keep me under control, I hope. University professors, of course, are known for speaking 48 minutes and not being able to stop and that sort of thing. But I'm going to try to keep it limited for all of the reasons that Ellen just indicated. I understand that people don't know very much, Americans by and large don't know very much about Indonesian society, Indonesian politics, history, and so forth. And so I really need a lot more time than I have to give you the kind of background necessary for the substance of my presentation, but I can't do that. I have to move right into the substance itself. But let me start off by saying that there are going to be three basic parts to this talk. A part about economics, Indonesian economics, a part about Indonesian politics, and a part about US-Indonesia relations. And so I'm going to try to keep 5 minutes or so to introduce you to what I think about each of those three things. And I've also got some PowerPoint slides here that we can come back to later on that capsulize the main arguments that I'm going to make. So hopefully we'll be able in the interaction and so forth to come back as well. Okay, well, this is Indonesia, and we'll have an opportunity to come back to the map too if you want. It's about as big as the United States. This northwestern tip of Sumatra here, the city of Banda Aceh, where the tsunami was several years ago, that's roughly Seattle. If we were to put Indonesia on a map of the United States, that's roughly Seattle. And down here, the end of Indonesia in Indonesian New Guinea, that's roughly Miami. So Indonesia stretches just about as far as the United States. The population is also quite substantial, the fourth largest country in the world at about 240 million people. The world's largest, the third largest democracy and the largest Muslim majority democracy, to put all those kinds of numbers in. But anyway, it's a very big country. It's the biggest country that you've never heard of. This is often said to American audiences, and I think that's generally true. Probably the most important country you've never heard of either. But we can come back to these map issues later on. There's background. Indonesia has been a democracy since 1998, 1999, when President Suharto stepped down and was succeeded by his vice president, B.J. Habibie, who immediately called for national elections, which were held within a year. And it was those national elections which were conducted for the first time since 1955. So we have a gap of 44 years between democratic elections in Indonesia. The interim period was a period of personal dictatorship under President Sukarno, the nation's founder, and then of military dictatorship under General Suharto, which lasted about 33 years. And that's most of my career. I started studying Indonesian politics in 1962. I went there for the first time, and President Sukarno was in power then. But General Suharto took over a few years after that in 1965-66, and so essentially my whole career was watching Indonesian politics under General Suharto. Toward the end, I started saying, I wish he would step down just for my sake. I'm kind of bored, and I'd like to see some change in Indonesian politics. Well, he did very nicely for me in 1998, and so I've been able to study Indonesian politics as a democracy, a really lively democracy, ever since that time. So we have now a period of a decade, a little more than a decade, in which Indonesia has been a democracy. And I want to emphasize here, and we can come back to this in the Q&A too, I want to emphasize that one of the really important parts about this democratization has been decentralization to the local level. Indonesian politics is at its most vibrant at the county and municipality level. There are about 500 counties and municipalities in Indonesia, and they all elect heads. It's just like a city council and mayor system. They all elect heads on a 5-year rotation basis, and that's where the most interesting politics is in Indonesia today. So we might want to come back to that later on. Okay, now as I said, the talk is going to be in 3 parts. Economic growth in this last decade or so, politics in the last decade or so, and US-Indonesia relations. On the economic side, it's mostly positives. Indonesia is usually ranked these days with the new Asian tigers, China and India, which have had such fantastic economic growth. Indonesia hasn't been quite that successful, but they've done just fine. This year, I think about 6.5% in 2011, about 6.5% growth rate. What is the American growth rate? Less than 2%? But that's not a fair comparison because we're talking about the developing world versus the already developed world. China and India both have better records than that. But anyway, the main message that I have about the economy is that it's positive, but with some weaknesses. And those weaknesses have to do mainly with faster growth. They could be doing as well as China and India, and also with better distribution. That the benefits of that growth could be spread more widely in the society, could reach a lower level of the population. So I have a few graphs here. This one shows you the economic growth. This is economic growth rate. This is negative economic growth, which is the best explanation of why Suharto is no longer in power. The Asian economic crisis of 1997, 98, 99 was what finally forced Suharto to step down. And this is negative growth of minus 13% at the nadir in 1999. But after that, under democracy, we have restored economic growth and then slowly growing. This says 6.5% here. I think this is 07. I like this chart because it's got President Abdurrahman Wahid in here, and it says erratic and shaky, and then it says President Megawati here, consolidation and acceleration, and then President Yudhoyono, the current president, throws away momentum and then made correction. That kind of gets at what I have in mind also. The growth has been okay, but it could have been better under better presidential leadership, and so that summarizes that kind of nicely. So that shows you the economic growth since democracy has begun in Indonesia. Here's the comparison with China and India. Indonesia is the red here. This is only this downturn here reflects the recent world recession, and I think that Indonesia went down to 4-something% in that year, 2009 or 2008, but is now back up to 6.5. So you can see what was reflected in the other graph, the kind of steady rise. India, on the other hand, has an average growth rate much better than that, and China also has an average growth rate even better than that. And this is what I say Indonesia could be having the same kind of growth rate as those two countries, but in my view, because of weak presidential leadership, does not. And again, we can come back to that. Indonesia's share of world GDP, here is the reality check. This is 1.5% of world GDP. Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world, but it only has 1.5% of world GDP. So this tells you Indonesia is not yet a really major economy, but it is moving in that direction, and that's really the main reason why I put this up here. What we see is Indonesia going from 1980, slowly improving its economy and getting closer and closer to having an industrial economy. It may take them another 20 or so years to really achieve an industrial economy, but that's the direction in which they are going. And this chart also shows you that it's a good kind of growth. What's happening here, this is Indonesia, manufacturing and agriculture. This is a comparison with ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, of which Indonesia is a part. Also, most Southeast Asian countries are a part of that grouping. So it shows you the comparison with ASEAN, the comparison with China and South Korea. But what is interesting to see here is manufacturing goes up. This is the way economic development should take place. Manufacturing goes up and agriculture goes down. It's not that agriculture is declining, but as a percentage of the national economy. So agriculture is a percentage of our economy too, very low, manufacturing very high, and so forth. So this shows you the direction of economic growth here is right. Now I said that there have been some problems. It's not all a great growth story. They have problems of distribution as well. Here you see the proportion of the population on less than $2 a day. So, So it goes, it was in 1984, at the beginning of the real economic growth, it was still over 80%. It's now down to about 50%. So there is steady progress here in reducing poverty, but they still have a long way to go. $2 a day, of course, is not very high income for people to live on. So this gives you some sense, this sets the problem that Indonesia is facing, that it has to find some way to further reduce that poverty. Okay, so those are the, did I miss I thought I had another. Oh yeah, but this just shows you the same thing. Export of goods and services shows you also that agriculture is declining as a percentage, manufacturers are going up as a percentage over the long time period. So all of the economists in the room will say, yeah, they're doing it the right way, obviously. They're not too reliant on agriculture as the old colonial economies were, state agriculture and so forth, but they've been moving away from that. Okay. All right, politics since 1998 has been positive with free, fair, and peaceful elections. 1999, 2004, 2009, they have had peaceful, free, and fair elections. A minimal amount of cheating, rather more vote buying and stuff like that, and that's a problem that is maybe getting worse. But in general, nobody has been questioning the results of these elections. Also, you have a free press, have had since 1999 as well, a genuinely free press. So you can think of the Indonesian political model very much on American lines. They have elections, in this case every 5 years instead of every 4, but they have all of the infrastructure to make that work properly as we do in the United States. I will just throw in here as well that these elections at the local level, elections for mayors and county heads, has been conducted on a 5-year basis as well. It's a rolling basis, so they're forever, every month practically, there's an election someplace in Indonesia at the local level. So they are also having free, fair, and peaceful elections in 500 counties and districts every 5 years in Indonesia. So those are all positive aspects of Indonesian politics. On the negative side, there is plenty of corruption, and I think about putting this in with the economy, because many business people, foreign business people as well as domestic business people, have a real problem with the level of corruption in Indonesian society, and many people refuse to invest or put their money elsewhere where they don't have to deal with the problems of corruption. So corruption is an economic problem as well as a political or governmental problem, but in any way I put it in this category. Very serious problems of corruption, and also problems, a little surprisingly, problems of religious tolerance. Indonesia has a long history of religious tolerance. Indeed, in the Suharto years, the military dictatorship, Indonesia kept getting promoted. I remember Paul Wolfowitz, later one of the neocons who created President Bush's Iraq policy, but in the days when I knew him, ambassador to Indonesia, and he was forever praising Indonesia, and a wonderful ambassador too, the best ambassador that I ever saw in Indonesia. That's not a comment about Iraq, it's just a comment about Indonesia. He was an excellent ambassador in Indonesia. But he used to say in his speeches all the time, he used to emphasize the religious tolerance that was characteristic of Indonesian society. But some part of that had to do with the military dictatorship of Suharto, an Indonesian who was determined to maintain religious tolerance and this reputation, and it's been more of a struggle in the democratic years. So I'll say a few things about that. Okay, here's the positive side of the elections. This is President Yudhoyono, all decked out in blue, which is the color of this particular blue is the color of his political party, and all those banners and so forth. So he's at a campaign rally for his political party. Wonderful for me, as somebody who watched these dictators all these years, to see this politician. He's a general, a retired general, but he's a politician out there campaigning for votes just like anybody else. And he turned out to be a pretty good campaigner, too. So anyway, here you have an ex-general who is now the president of Indonesia as a campaigner. This is another scene about elections in Indonesia. This is the PDIP, the Indonesian Democracy Party of Struggle, which is Megawati Sukarno Putri's political party. She was president of Indonesia. She was the second democratic president of Indonesia, actually, in this current period. But I put this up here so you have some sense of the raucousness of Indonesian elections. When President Yudhoyono stands up there and campaigns, it all seems very calm and so forth, but PDIP audiences tend not to be so calm. I also like this. This is a campaign poster, and this woman is campaigning for a seat in Parliament, which is identified with those numbers. Her political party is a Christian political party. You can see from the cross up there. It's called the Partai Damai Sejahtera, the Prosperous Peace Party. It only got, I've forgotten what the percentage of the vote was, maybe a couple of percent of the vote. Indonesia only has about 10% Christian population, about 5% Protestant, 4% Catholic, and this is a Protestant party. But most of the Protestant voters vote for Megawati's PDIP in that last picture. But I like this. She says, please come close. Listen to the cries of the people. That's that jeritan rakyat. Listen to the cries of the people. Don't just pass by. Make the right choice, meaning me, Selfana Gunawan. This also tells you something about the personalism of Indonesian politics. The Yudhoyono picture maybe doesn't convey that quite in the same way. Individuals are rather more important and have been becoming more and more important in Indonesian politics, Indonesian individuals as opposed to political parties. And so you can see she's identified by a political party up there. You have to vote for her party in order to vote for her, but she's really campaigning as an individual. And this is the typical campaign poster in national and local elections. I'm clueless as to what this figure down here is supposed to be. But anyway, there's Selfana, the candidate for parliament, who obviously didn't win because she comes from a party that's too small to win. Okay, this is another scene of elections. This is in Aceh. But national elections. And of course, this is an Achenese woman who is wearing hijab, or as it is called in Indonesia, jilbab. So Muslim voters as a part of the national political system as well. I said that there are negative aspects to the politics as well. There are really two parts to this negative aspect. One is just incompetence. the inability of the Indonesian government infrastructure to do what is necessary to build a modern society and a modern economy. And here, this is the quality of infrastructure. So what is the quality of roads and airports and bridges and those kinds of things? And Indonesia, this is an executive survey that ranked these responses from the World Economic Forum. And you can see Hong Kong, South Korea, Australia, this gives you some measure, and Indonesia is way down here. So this is a developing country. That 1 point, this is echoed from that 1.5% of GDP, world GDP that comes from Indonesia. It is still a developing economy, still at the beginning of trying to create the infrastructure for a modern economy. And here is where I fault President Yudhoyono the most, and I hope we do come back to this in questions, because this is what President Yudhoyono ought to be doing much more of, building roads and bridges and airports and so forth, to create the infrastructure for private business. And he's been very lackadaisical about that. As a result, Indonesia is not moving very far in these lines. Incompetence is one problem of government. The other problem is corruption, as I identified it already on the earlier slide. This is Transparency International, which does surveys of business people and others about economies. Indonesia is down here as one of the worst economies in the world in terms of its propensity to bribe. This is propensity to bribe. So Russia is the worst. China is pretty close, but Mexico and Indonesia are down here as the countries in which bribery of government officials is one of the biggest problems. You see this also in a survey conducted by Gallup in Indonesia, in which people are asked if you do business with the government, do you have to bribe them and so forth? And the answers are this kind of consistently, it's even getting worse from 2006 to 2008. The percentage of Indonesians saying yes to the question, is corruption widespread in the government? Is corruption widespread within businesses located in this country? So it's virtually unanimous that corruption is a huge problem in the Indonesian economy. One way that the Indonesian government is trying to deal with this is through the KPK, the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Corruption Eradication Commission, which was founded at the end of Megawati Sukarno Putri's presidency and has been growing ever since. It's not controlled by Parliament or controlled by the President. It's an independent body. And both have tried to interfere with its actions, but it's been relatively successful. I just spent the last 2 weeks in Jakarta. I came back about a week ago, and the newspapers for the whole 2 weeks that I was in Jakarta, all they are talking about is people who have been charged by the KPK and what the evidence is against them and those kinds of things. So the headlines day after day are about corruption. That's a good sign, too. To my mind, I'm a basically optimistic sort of person, and I look at these headlines and I think, yeah, there's a lot of corruption in the country, but they're also really trying to tackle it. So this is a poster from the Anti-Corruption Commission, and it says, "Awas, look out. There is a latent danger of corruption." And that's an official poster, KPK down below, official poster from that. And then a cartoon in a local English language newspaper. These are members of parliament. Anybody has any experience with Indonesia, you can see, oh yeah, they've made these shadow play characters. Wayang Kulit, shadow play characters is what these are taken from and are supposed to remind you of. But they're members of, this is a KPK investigator, and he's coming to parliament. The DPR is parliament, and they're saying, damn it, I got to hide my money. So that gives you some sense of fear in the parliament about the KPK, which I think is quite real. Okay, but not to worry about corruption, because Indonesia is also a place where there are more people using Facebook than any place else. In absolute numbers, more people in Indonesia using Facebook than anywhere else in the world. And so this poster says, Facebookers care about the KPK. And I think that's right. This is the way in which Indonesians spread information about who might be guilty of crimes, and this information gets passed on and so forth. So I love that there, that we can put the Facebook symbol up there. It tells you also that Indonesia is taking maximum advantage of the social network availability and so forth for political purposes. Okay, now the next thing, the last thing I want to say about domestic politics in Indonesia, and I see I've used my 20 minutes, so I'm going to have to be really quick here about the end. The last thing I want to say about the problems that the government faces are the religious intolerance issue. Basically, most Indonesians are in fact tolerant, both within Islam. Those who are Muslims are tolerant of various points of view within Islam, and they are tolerant of other religions, Hindus in Bali, Protestants and Catholics in various parts of the country. But there has been a militant group that has been growing over the last 20 or 30 years, as it has in many Muslim-majority countries in the world. And that Muslim minority has been pushing the envelope as far as it can on a number of issues. Jim Castle, that piece, the Great Decision series, the piece that you've read, talks about religious intolerance of the terrorist kind, in which the Indonesian government has done pretty well. But he also talks about, that is to say, arresting and so forth, the people who are planning or have engaged in international terrorism. But there is also another kind, which is local level kinds of conflicts between groups and so forth. And what this one is about is Ahmadiyya. Ahmadiyya is a sect within Islam that is not respected, not accepted as Muslim by most Indonesian Muslims. Nonetheless, they don't bother it. They leave it alone. Only the militants have seized upon this as an opportunity to force Islam into more traditional directions, or more conservative, more socially conservative directions. And so here you see, destroy Ahmadiyya. They have a false prophet, the teachings of a false prophet. The prophet was named Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, and he was, after Muhammad, a teacher within Islam, who they claim, some claim was a prophet, some claim just a teacher. But anyway, very few Muslims like Ahmadiyya, but nonetheless, most have been tolerant of it before the militants got started. So Ganyang Ahmadiyya, destroy Ahmadiyya. One of the reasons why this is so difficult to get at, so difficult for the government to act against, is that there is very widespread opposition, or you can mobilize widespread opposition pretty easily in Indonesian society. This is obviously a middle class or even upper class woman wearing fancy sunglasses and with city buildings behind her and so forth, but she also says, disband Ahmadiyya, disband Ahmadiyya. And so it makes it difficult. The president and other politicians have to have political courage to act against this kind of constituency. But by and large, they do not have political courage, and the result is something like this. This was the beating to death of an Ahmadiyya member in a town not so very far away from Jakarta. That's been, in the picture, that's been made so that you can't see it clearly. But that's what these people, these militants, are doing. Not that woman back there looking so beautiful in her white hijab and so forth, but this is the kind of thing that is being done in her name. And in that same village, what happened after that person was killed was they burned down his house. So this is the religious intolerance that has been growing in Indonesia, and as I say, the Indonesian government hasn't been doing enough about it. Okay, US-Indonesia relations, I have two quick slides here. The first is the general one, and the second one is where we're going today. The general one says, Indonesia has never had a really high priority with the United States. We always care much more about China, Japan, South Korea. That's the historical pattern. And there are plenty of justifications for that, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. But Indonesia has always been pointed to, especially within the Pentagon, as a place of particular strategic importance. There are deep water channels that the U.S. Navy uses for its submarines and things of that kind. So when I'm asked to the Pentagon to talk about Indonesia, I'm always linking up with these naval people who have those kinds of connections. One of the problems in U.S.-Indonesian foreign policy is the degree of hostility to the United States that comes from Indonesian nationalism. Doesn't have anything to do with religion, I think. There is the Muslim problem, but basically it's Indonesian nationalism, which goes back to their revolution between 1945 and 1949, and a sense that the whole West was against them, that the United States wants to control the world, and that we have to be very careful to keep our independence from the United States. Now, I don't want to go too far with that, but that's a kind of underlying notion in the Indonesian political culture. And so it's something that has to be dealt with. And once again, Paul Wolfowitz, as ambassador, was terrific. He understood that, and he was very good in dealing with it. But that's kind of those are three very general points about U.S.-Indonesia relations. More specific ones today, Indonesia is of growing interest to the U.S. because of its economic success that I talked about at the beginning, because it's being seen increasingly as a balancer against China. As China gets more and more successful and has more and more aggressive foreign policy itself, the expectation in the United States is that Indonesia is going to be helpful as a balancer against China. Indonesia is also the largest Muslim majority democracy, maybe the only real Muslim majority democracy, and so the United States policymakers would also like to use it as a model for the Islamic world, for the Egyptians and the Libyans and so forth. And under the Obama administration, there has also been heightened attention paid to Indonesia. Here is one example of that heightened tension. President Obama made a trip to Jakarta, and this was the state dinner with President and Mrs. Yudhoyono. This is the picture that appeared on the cover of Tempo magazine, which is Jakarta's equivalent, Indonesia's equivalent of Time or Newsweek. And when he came to Jakarta, and it says, Obama comes home. Obama comes home. Because he went to school for several years in Jakarta, and they had been waiting for him to come back as president of the United States. But this is a photoshopped picture. Because it was a big controversy at the time about Obama visiting a Muslim-majority country, and isn't he a secret Muslim and all of that kind of stuff. So they're oblivious to this, I think, in Indonesia. This hat is a symbol of Indonesian nationalism as well as of Islam. And so what they were really doing was identifying with Obama, saying, you have some feeling for us as Indonesians to the point to which you will wear an Indonesian nationalist hat. But they put it on him. And the final slide tells you something more about the relationship or the feeling that Indonesians have for Obama. This is the statue that was first erected in a public park in Jakarta. This is the young Obama, the schoolboy Obama, in bronze. That was the private donor. I don't think he released his name. But a private donor paid for the sculpture, and it was in a public park for a while. And then there was a controversy that had to do with nationalism. Who is this guy? He's not Indonesian. What contribution has he made to Indonesia? This is the controversy in the Indonesian press. And so finally, they put it in the school. They put it in front of the school. This is where in its original place. They put it in front of the school where Obama was a student in the, whenever that was, 1970s or 1980s. And that's where I saw it. I made a trip to see it a couple of years ago. And sure enough, there it is. And the school kids all came out and they said, we're so proud to have President Obama in front of our school, and stuff like that, you know. So, so there, that gives you some sense, I think, that you would not have another American president who would be portrayed as sympathetic to Indonesian nationalism or for whom a statue would be constructed when he had just barely become president. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Do you want me over there? Is that the format?
Okay, well, thank you for a wonderful, insightful, interesting presentation and terrific illustrations. I like that iconic picture of President Obama in a different garb than we have usually seen him before. Well, just a couple questions for Bill, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. Looking back to the map at the beginning, Indonesia is an enormous place. 17,000 islands, 350 languages. How have they put this country together and hold it together? In America, we have a continental-sized superstate. We're all on one piece of land, but here's 240 million people on thousands of islands, speaking hundreds of different languages.
Right. Well, I guess I should throw in right away that water joins as much as it divides. So it's easier to get from these places in Sumatra, and the east coast of Sumatra, around here by sea than it is over land. This is the Ring of Fire. all the way from Indonesia through Japan, the Ring of Fire, in the sense this is all volcanic, high mountains and so forth. So the spine of all of these islands is quite high. And so people get from one place to another, historically, much more by boat. And so you shouldn't think of water as necessarily a divider. But that's not the most important answer. The most important answer is that, like the United States, Indonesia was a creation of a foreign colonial power, right? In our case, the British, and in the Indonesian case, the Dutch. But all of this really is administered as a single place only starting around 1875. Before that time, there's a long Dutch history, but the real Dutch administration comes just in the last century, or even 2/3 of a century, before the Second World War. But in that period of time, you do have a uniform administrative system across most of this country. And it's that uniform administrative system that the rising Indonesian nationalists, young people, men and women, mostly men, but some women, trained in Dutch, educated in Dutch, basically, but seeing themselves as a single people, because it's these foreign Dutch, who are these Dutch people? From very far away, this small, cold country on the North Sea, is the way that they like to put it. And so a nationalist movement starts to grow, and the focus from the beginning was on taking over the whole of the country, not breaking it up in ethnic terms. And so the first answer is the Dutch create the administrative frame. The second answer is the Indonesian nationalists make it happen, create the legitimacy of the sense of a single nation.
But I've been to Indonesia a number of times, and I kept looking for a Dutch heritage, and I never heard any Dutch. I never saw any Dutch signs. But instead the people spoke a language, Bahasa Indonesia. I know the other part of it from Bahasa Malaysia. In fact, I heard somewhere that the Indonesians borrowed their national language from the Malaysians.
I guess they would have to. There's a lot of conflict these days between Indonesians and Malaysians over who owns what. There are a lot of popular songs that the Malaysians claim as their national heritage, and Indonesians say, "Wait a minute, that's our national heritage." But I think they would not give you an argument that the language originally comes from here. West Malaysia, the language of, this is West Malaysia today, East Malaysia over here, former British colony. The language was Malay or Malay. I've taught in Singapore for 2 years, and nobody understands the word Malay in Singapore. It's British accent, and so they all say Malay, and so I say Malay too. M-A-L-A-Y is the language of here. And that language was the traders' language, like Swahili in East Africa, the traders' language for centuries. There was a port here of Malacca, and the port of Malacca, the language of the port of Malacca became the traders' language throughout the archipelago, well into New Guinea. And so that's the basis. That then was decided. At the same time that these Indonesian nationalists are deciding they're going to create a country, they also create a language, or they take this language and they say, we're going to make this our unifying language. Not Dutch, which didn't seem to them to be a useful language abroad or a useful language domestically because there weren't enough speakers of it. But Malay was very widely spoken, and so they could turn it into a national language, which they did. And after independence, so that's maybe the third answer to your question. Mm-hmm. Administration is the first, and then the nationalists' activities. And the third one is the unifying force of Bahasa Indonesia, the national language. After independence, they started building schools, elementary and then higher schools, from one end of the archipelago to the other, in which Indonesian is the language of instruction. And so today, if I travel from up here, I have traveled a couple of times, one or another assignment from up here to over here. You get off the plane, and it's like here, you get off the plane, right, and everybody speaks English, accented English, different ways and so forth, but English, and that's in Indonesia. You get off the plane, and everybody that you talk to speaks Indonesian. Below that, of course, the difference with America is they also speak their local language in all of those places. So here in Java, the language of East and Central Java is Javanese. In West Java, it's Sundanese, S-U-N-D-A. In Bali, everybody knows about Bali, right? I mean, here's the island of Bali. here. In Bali, that's about 1% of the total Indonesian, 1.5% total Indonesian population. They speak Balinese, but they all communicate with each other in Indonesian and with me in Indonesian as the national language. And you can do that all the way across. So that's been an amazing unifier, and it exists almost no place else. The Philippines, for example, the Filipinos are forced to depend on English because Southern Filipinos don't want to use the so-called national language, which is really based on Tagalog. So it's not everybody's language. But in Indonesia, it's virtually everybody's language because it was just a second language for everybody.
Well, one more question on terms of putting the place together and holding it together. I think of, well, you mentioned the current president, Yudhoyono, is a retired general, and not long before him was General Suharto, who was in power for more than 30 years. I wonder if you could comment on the role of the military in making Indonesia and what you think of its future. Will all presidents in the future still sort of need to be alumni of the military or not?
Yeah, I think that the military did play, on balance, I have to be careful with this because there's so many negatives as well as positives associated with the role of the military. But the military was a major actor in politics under Sukarno, so the late 1950s through the mid-1960s. And then, of course, it was the principal base of power for General Suharto from 1965 to 1998. It didn't rule. It wasn't like a junta in Latin America or something like that. President Suharto really ruled, and he used the military as his main base of support. You didn't oppose him. The religious tolerance issue, if local militant Muslims tried to foment something, then Suharto would make sure that the police or the army dealt with them. So very important part of his rule for most of those years, but also corrupt, as you would expect. I think they were, on balance, a unifier in these years because there were no political parties. We can make the comparison with India. In India, you had the Congress Party, which for more than 20 years was the single dominant party in India and had unified a lot of disparate groups. Indonesia didn't have that. And so the military, instead it had 4 major parties in the 1950s, and they fought with each other and so forth. So the military did serve that kind of unifying function for some time. But now, remarkably, after democratization in 1999, the military has really moved out of politics and also out of business. I mean, a good friend of mine, an ex-student of mine, who is a businessman in Jakarta now, he's in mining, coal mining and so forth, and so he really sees, where the military's role is and so forth, because this is all, again, corruption, connections with government and so forth. The military is practically nowhere in the business world anymore. And that's just 10 years or so after Suharto stepped down. Yudhoyono is president, but he's president because he retired from the military, he stepped out, he became Megawati's minister, coordinating minister for social welfare and so forth. He became a politician. He formed a political party and so forth. Very few military people in that party. So his presidency has little to nothing to do with the military.
That's quite a remarkable development.
Yeah,
I keep thinking, well, let's see, open the floor. Questions, please. We have microphones here and to the right, so how's that program? Come on down.
That's what I said. I'll go up. I threatened to come up in the audience and say, come on down, come on down. It's a great place for that.
In follow-up as to the military comments, what overlap did the utilization of the internet have to play, and how might that be a application to other areas of conflict in the world, particularly the Middle East Islamic area?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, the Arab Spring pioneered the use of the internet and Twitter and so forth. This happened in Indonesia in 1997, 98, 99. The transition was in those years, and there were very few internet users in Indonesia at that point, and of course no Twitter or Facebook or anything. So these new social media and even the internet had nothing to do with Indonesian democratization. So what we've seen in Tahrir Square in Cairo with the use of those social media is something totally new and not influenced at all by the Indonesian example.
Question?
If Indonesians have great affection for President Obama, and assuming President Obama likewise has an affection for Indonesians, what's the difference between regular U.S. foreign policy before and after Obama and Obama's stamp on U.S. foreign policy?
Truthfully, minimal. I'm a great believer in the role of individuals, and so I would like to have more evidence that President Obama, just because he's an individual politician and I'm watching him, has influence here. But I think it's pretty minimal. I think the first slide that last substantive slide that I gave you that has China, the need to balance against China and these kinds of things. This is what is really driving U.S. foreign policy. And it may be driven up just a little bit. We now have a comprehensive partnership, that's the language, but comprehensive partnership in diplomatic language doesn't have any meaning. It's a phrase that was created for the purpose of making Yudhoyono and Obama happy, that they could both have something to sell to their populations. And so there's going to be more money given for military assistance, I think a lot more money for educational assistance and so forth than has been the case in the past. But I don't think these more national interest-driven kinds of factors are the more important ones. However, everybody in Washington, in the Beltway, who has an interest in Indonesia is trying to seize the moment, because we think we have, I don't do this, I'm not in that world myself, but I hear from people who do, seize the moment here to use Obama, to get more programs through Obama and get the Indonesians to agree to them. But I think in the end it's going to be fairly minimal.
Thank you. Please.
With economic expansion or advancement, there often is a deterioration in the environment, and I was wondering if you could address that. And also, often there's a big movement of rural people into the urban areas and maybe loss of community and support. And also, you talked about religious intolerance. And you mentioned within the Muslim community, but I was just wondering about between the Christian Muslim groups.
Okay.
Those three things.
So those three questions.
The environment.
The first, environment.
Quality of life. Non-economic quality of life.
Cultural.
And religion.
And the third one was, religion
Right.
among groups.
Right.
Okay. Yes. Environmental sustainability is a huge problem. To the degree to which there is successful economic growth, there is I don't know one-to-one, but there's a close relationship with environmental deterioration. And we see this, of course, in China, where the Chinese economic growth has been pretty successful. A lot of it is coal-based, for example, and there's a lot of pollution as a result. Indonesia is I was going to say one of the world's largest producers of coal, but I don't know if that's true or not. But anyway, there's a lot of coal, and it's one of the biggest things that is being produced now in Indonesia. A lot of it is being exported, but a lot of it is going to be used also for power plants and things of that kind. So they do not have the environmental regulations in place, and so they are still on that curve of things getting worse instead of being in some kind of balance in which they are protecting the environment while also developing the economy. On culture and population and so forth, yes, I think that one of the reasons for the religious intolerance or for the growth in fundamentalism among Muslims is this seizing upon religious orthodoxy as a barrier against what happens to people who move into the cities from the villages. So you worry about your kids being out on the streets late at night in the greater Jakarta area, for example. There are several districts around Jakarta which have a lot of factories and stuff like that, and the parents have moved there for employment opportunities, but the kids are kind of let loose. And religion is a way of trying, it's more religion than ethnic roots. Religion is, and especially among Muslims, but I also see it among Christians. and Hindu, Balinese too, for that matter. They all try to use religion as a way of keeping the kids loyal to the past and have them be moral and so forth. I don't know if it's succeeding or not. We have the same problem in the United States, right? I mean, I've taught generations of students at Ohio State, and the parents in Chillicothe, Ohio, are all complaining about what happens to the kids when they come to the Ohio State campus. So these tensions exist, I think, in all societies in which you are having this kind of modernization. But yes, it's a pretty serious problem. At the same time, I am in my soul an anthropologist. And I have lived several times now in Indonesian villages and visited. I go back to the villages that I once lived in 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and so forth. And I still see a lot of vitality in those villages. People who are trying to create a modern life, but still within those confines. Education, I said schools across the country. Well, there's now a village school, within walking distance for every 7-year-old in the country. Well, that right away, that tells you, these kids at least they don't have to go to the city to get education at that level. It's, of course, more complicated than that, and we could talk later, as you get closer to high school and university and so forth, then, of course, like here, they're more and more moving away. But there is this sense that we want to preserve a village life, we want to create a modern life, which is, at the same time, uniquely Indonesian, which means still more farming than you have in the United States, for example, they will say to me. And the third issue was religious tension, religious intolerance. In recent years, it has been more within the Muslim community by the militants against groups like Ahmadiyya. Or there was an anti-pornography law that was promoted for several years and finally was passed. And the Christians stayed out of that. The Christians, socially conservative Christians, did not support the pornography law because they saw it as one step in the direction of Sharianization and making Sharia law, Islamic law, the law of the land in Indonesia. So that was a debate within the Muslim community about pornography and so forth in the media and whatever. But there is also a kind of continuing tension between these militant Muslims and the Christian communities. A few years ago, a Catholic group was going to have a retreat in the mountains outside of Jakarta, and some militant groups stormed the retreat and made them withdraw from it. I was really embarrassed, and I was amazed that, I don't know whether Catholics internationally mobilized against that or not, because they're in a difficult position, a minority position, kind of difficult for them to mobilize internationally. But that's the kind of, and there's a Protestant church which has not been able to get a license, and the local mayor has ruled that this church cannot, has to be banned and so forth, outside of Jakarta, and people were hoping for President Yudhoyono to step in, but he did not. So yes, there is conflict going on. There is a fear of Christianization within the militant part of the Muslim community, and sometimes it's easy for them to sell that more broadly. Christians convert with soap and blankets, that is to say, material goods. You give unthinking village Muslims a few material possessions, and you'll get them into church. These are the kinds of debates that go on in Indonesian society all the time. But at the moment, it's much more within the Islamic community.
Thank you. Yes, I think you were animal.
Kind of a follow-up to the question on religion, in a series of questions, actually. What's the history of the Muslim domination of, that's the largest Muslim country.
Right.
None of the neighbors are predominantly Muslim. How did that happen? Furthermore, is there a split between Sunni and Shia, or is it primarily Sunni? And then what was the impact of the Dutch colonialization on the religious life?
Okay. Let's see. The first question was, how did it happen? It was peaceful. Actually, Malaysia, the Malay population of Malaysia is Muslim. And there are Muslim minorities in Thailand. Where's Thailand? Yeah, over here. There are Muslim minorities in Thailand as well. There was one in Cambodia. So and of course, the southern Philippines is also Muslim. 10 or 15% of the Philippine population is Muslim. So it wasn't just what is now the Indonesian archipelago, but you're right that that's mainly what it was. It was peaceful. It was brought by trade. The politics of it were that there were, especially in Java, there were interior kingdoms which were built on Hindu ideologies from many centuries before, imports from India. So you go, if you've been in Cambodia to Angkor, and we were just talking about Angkor earlier, or in Indonesia, in Java, you have Borobudur and Prambanan and so forth, these great temple complexes and so forth. These were built by Hindus about the year 0 AD. And so we have Hindu culture, Hindu-Buddhist culture actually mixed until about 1400. And it's at that point that these traders come in. But there was never any conquest. Islam did not come to Indonesia by conquest. But as I say, it hit the coastal areas first, penetrated the coastal areas first, and then these areas used Islam as a means of separating from the interior kingdoms. So they didn't have to pay tribute to the interior kingdoms. And so as of even today, you have uneven Islamization, more pious in the coastal areas, less pious in the interior. So if you go to a place like Yogyakarta or Surakarta, also called Solo, here in central Java, where there are sultanates, going, that's an Islamic-sounding word, I guess, but what it means is these ancient Hindu kingdoms. And those are still pretty powerful sources of moral values. Again, the shadow play that I mentioned before, the wayang kulit in Indonesia and Java, that's a Hindu tradition that lives on. So you have this mix still today, although most Indonesians have become at least formally Muslims. What was Sunni Shia, all Sunni. And within Sunni, they are all adherents to the Shafi'i school, which is called madhab in Sunni Islam. There are 4 classical schools of judicial interpretation, and only one of them came to Indonesia. So they are all really unified in those terms. What they did get was a split along what are called modernist versus traditionalist lines. Traditionalist means sticking with the school of interpretation, the Shafi'i school of interpretation. Modernist means it's really a Protestant Catholic distinction. Going back to the Bible, going back to the Quran as the main source of authority, as opposed to those schools of interpretation that built up over the centuries. And so the modernists are the Protestants of Indonesia, and they have basically 2 wings. Sounds very familiar to the United States. One is more conservative or puritanical, and that's the one that is more open to Wahhabi influences and so forth. And then one that is more liberal and moderate and tolerant and so forth. Just like Protestantism in the United States has both its right and its left. And so you have that within modernism in Indonesia as well. So you do have that split, modernist versus traditionalist. And each of those groups has a huge organization. The 2 largest Muslim social organizations in the world, Nahdlatul Ulama, or NU, the Renaissance, it means the awakening or renaissance of traditional religious teachers, ulama, is one of those organizations, and the other one is Muhammadiyah, followers of Muhammad. And NU probably has 50 or 60 million members, huge organization, and Muhammadiyah probably has 20 or 30 million members. And we come back to the military question. Why was the military so willing to step down in 1998 when Suharto stepped down? One of the principal reasons was those 2 huge organizations, because their leaders said, we are not in favor of an Islamic state. Both of those leaders. And so very different from Egypt, right? Where Egyptians, the Egyptian military and so forth, have been worrying for decades about what happens if the military relaxes its pressure. Well, in Indonesia, the military and everybody else was worried about that as well, but you could see over the last 20 or 30 years of the Suharto government that those 2 giant organizations were not in favor of Sharia, they were in favor of a basic democratic state. And so the military could step back knowing that, unlike Egypt, knowing that they would not be replaced by militant Islam. Is that all 3? Colonialism's impact on religion. That 12% Protestants, 4% Catholics. That's a result of mostly European colonialism, Dutch, German, and so forth. There's some American element in that as well. There were some American Baptists and Methodists and so forth there, but mostly Dutch and German. I lived, my first 2 years in Indonesia, I lived up here in the province of North Sumatra, where people still pay visits to the grave of Pastor Nomensen, who was a German Lutheran who began the Batak Lutheran Church in that area. It's called the HKBP, the HKBP, and it is the largest Christian church in Asia, maybe today. And I know it very well because these are my people up here. I lived with them for 2 years when I was a student, so I can see that the Protestant Lutheranism from Germany, they're members of the World Lutheran Organization, World WLO, whatever that is. They're members of that, and they go back and forth a lot. And I was just at a resort, a little resort on Lake Toba up here, just a few weeks ago. And as our boat comes into the place where we're staying, it's called Wisma Agape. Wisma means hotel or visiting guest house. Agape is a Christian word. Christian love is called Wisma Agape, and as you drive up, it said in German, welcome. Willkommen, and so forth. Not that many people are speaking German anymore, but there is this sense that we, the Bataks of North Sumatra, owe a lot to the German missionaries. Yeah.
Fascinating. Please.
I wish I could have given you that whole sentence. You know, I took a picture of it.
This brings back many memories. I have one comment and then a question.
Okay.
The comment is we lived in Indonesia for 3 years during the 80s, and I called on J.E. Habibie, who was the Secretary General of the Ministry of Communications, brother of B.J. Habibie, who later became president.
Right.
And while I was talking to him, the telephone rang and he started talking Dutch. And I thought, who is this person
mid-80s.
talking Dutch to? And later on, I asked him, and he said, I was talking to my brother. And I mentioned that to a couple Indonesians, and they said, obviously, what they're trying to do is show you how well educated they were, because there were very few Indonesians in the 80s, that level, that could speak that kind of Dutch, and that meant they were very well educated in the Dutch schools. At least that's what I was told by my Indonesian interlocutors. The question I have has to do with corruption. In the 80s, Australia National University did a lot of research, wrote a lot of on economics, particularly in India,
Right.
and they probably still do. But one of the things they said is that government regulations made it so difficult for business to operate that government was just throwing sand in the gears of this running machine all the time, and you needed to have oil to lubricate those gears in order to make it run at all. Now remember, the early 80s was before the Habibie children started raping the country, and I'm just wondering if that resonates with you at all, and if the government has gotten away from some of those stifling regulations, which made it almost impossible for business to operate in the early 80s. Thank you.
Let's see. On the first question, I'm surprised that Habibie's brother was speaking. Fanny Habibie, he's called. He was, I think, ambassador to the Netherlands at one point. Yeah, but at some point, I'm trying to remember about the Dutch part of this, because it is certainly true that very few, your main point, that very few Indonesians at that level speak Dutch. And it surprises me about Habibie because he was raised in Makassar, in the Celebes and so forth, and I don't know that he would have been, let's see, he's about my age. Yeah, this is possible, but Habibie's real second language is German. Vice President or President Habibie. But anyway, that's very interesting that he also spoke Dutch. I'll have to find out more about that. Okay, the second question was corruption. Well, you know, I tried to lay out my views on corruption here. One way to think about this is that under Suharto, there's a famous economist, Mansur Olson, I think, who introduced these terms, stationary bandit and roving bandit. Under Suharto, corruption exhibited the problems of a stationary bandit, meaning one person who was in charge of corruption for the whole economy. And so that kept large-scale corruption down because Suharto saw to it that what corruption there was in his interest. And now it's a country of roving bandits. I said you have 500 county and municipal governments in Indonesia, and there's a lot of power at that level. 30% of the national budget is given to that level in block grants. has been since the early 2000s. And so you have all these roving bandits. That is to say, you have 500 Suhartos, 500 local government officials who are engaged in corruption. And so most business people say, worse now than then, less predictable now than then, because you have so many hands in the pot now. But it's a continuing battle, as I identified with the KPK.
Thank you. This might end up being the last question. It was a question text in from the audience, and you addressed it in part, but maybe there's even more to it. So the question is, if before becoming a democracy, the military was an extremely integral and powerful part of the Indonesian politics, how was it that there was not more resistance to yielding their power in 1998? So you already addressed the issue that the military didn't fear that it would be an Islamic takeover, but were there more issues? Maybe
there have been a number of interpretations of that. Actually, one point that I made before was that the military was not actually in power under Suharto. I mean, it's the military that brought Suharto to power, but Suharto was a kind of personal dictator who used the military as his base. But what that means is that all of the politics in the country was Suharto's politics. It was not a board of generals sitting around and talking about national policy. Everybody was a kid. Everybody was immature, an adolescent in Indonesia, and Suharto was the only grown-up. And that really included the military. And so they didn't have much of an idea about what they should do if they were suddenly thrust into power. And we're talking, the military that took over in 1965-66 was Suharto, the major general, and so forth. But the military in 1998-1999 consisted of people who had been kids or not born at that time, and they didn't have a sense of what they should do. There was no plan to take power. So that's one way to think about it. They also had just been revising their doctrine to get them out of active politics. And the ideological argument here, or the argument about what a military should do, was that a military should basically be defending the country. And by being too involved in politics, we set ourselves up for internal division. And we don't want to continue that after Suharto. So they were already having this debate before Suharto. In the 90s, they were having this debate before Suharto stepped down. So that's I think, a part of the answer as well. And I gave another part of the answer that the civilians, especially the Muslim organizations, made it clear that they would not turn Indonesia into an Islamic state. And so that was not necessary to protect Indonesia from an Islamic state. I interviewed General Wiranto, who was the commander of the armed forces when Suharto stepped down. He had just been appointed to that post a month or so before. He had been an adjutant to Suharto decades before. He's one of these people groomed, to be supportive of Suharto and so forth. But I interviewed General Wiranto, who was the key decision maker. When Suharto stepped down, Wiranto said, "I will protect you." This is this famous picture of Suharto saying he's going to step down. Habibie is behind him, and Wiranto is also behind him. And Wiranto is guaranteeing a peaceful civilian transition. And so when I interviewed Wiranto afterwards, I said, "Why did you do that? This was your chance, right? To take power for yourself, military coup, make the country better for, whatever, give him some option to do that." He said, "I would have had to kill too many people." It's a pretty pragmatic kind of answer, right? I would have had to kill too many people. And what he meant was there was so much opposition to Suharto and then to continued military rule, especially in Jakarta, all these demonstrations and so forth by students, that he would have had to have his troops killing students. And of course, that's his own kids, in the broad sense. That's the kids of the elite. I don't know where Wiranto's actual kids were at that moment, but it's the kids of the elite. And so he was not prepared to kill his own kids in that sense. And I think that's probably true.
Perfect.
Well, I was kind of curious about the one slide that showed agricultural going down, and mining going down as a percentage of GDP. So
that's not. You're somebody who knows too much.
So I was kind of curious, because what we hear is that mining in Indonesia,
is up,
and particularly in coal, is way up.
It is.
So I was curious about what is driving
It is. I can't do everything in a 20-minute presentation.
Oh, okay.
But
the real question I had, though, if that is still the case, that mining is
up.
Are the local communities, are they able to participate in that boom that's going on in the mining in Indonesia, or is it foreign mining, is it government mining, or are the locals being able to benefit from it?
Yes. The first answer is that yes, mining, of course, this is petroleum up here. And so that's been going down, but coal mining has been going up. And so what we are seeing here, this increase, is mainly coal mining. And it has continued. It has continued. So the modern economy still has a big share. Actually, there are two elements, a mining element and an agricultural element. The agricultural element is palm oil plantations, and those are the two most prosperous, most rapidly growing parts of the Indonesian economy today. And what I wanted to show you, of course, was this broader picture going back to the 80s and stuff, where manufacturing is becoming more of a part of the total economy. But if we look on a more short-term basis, or what is exciting people in Jakarta today, they will talk about palm oil and coal. And the people who are benefiting from the coal mining are not the local people. There's a certain amount of coal mining in Papua, for example, and the local people are certainly not benefiting from that. They're the least populous, and so you don't have to pay attention to them, just on those terms, but they're also the least modernized of Indonesians in Papua, and so their interests just get dismissed.
Is that at all what's driving the nationalist fervor in Indonesia, or is that and to try to keep some of that?
Oh, no, there's no nationalist fervor. This is not like China, where we've been seeing a kind of rise in national fervor. No, I wanted to kind of benchmark that to say Indonesians are nationalists, and Americans have to take account of that, because sometimes Indonesians will react in surprising ways. We think they're friends of Obama and they're cooperating with us and so forth, but there is this underlying strong nationalism which can be very defensive. But there's no rise of it today. We'll see. There's going to be presidential elections in 2014, and there could be some more of it then, because one of the leading candidates, Prabowo Subianto, is pushing a populist line at the moment, a Hugo Chavez, Venezuelan kind of line. And so we'll see how far he gets with that and what the consequences of it are. But I don't think. I think that the core of Indonesian culture understands how to deal with a global economy.
Thank you very much for a very lively and engaging talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both, Dr. Liddle and Dr. Dooley.
Yeah, thank you.
Please join us next week for our last session of the series. It's on energy geopolitics, an issue of national security, with Dr. James Bartas from the RAND Corporation in Arlington, Virginia. See you next week. Enjoy the weather.